Hello, I'm Professor Kitch from Angelo State University. I'm really glad you decided to join us for our Rocketry Camp. We've got a week of really exciting things planned for you, and I know you'll have a good time. You know, ultimately, engineering is about making the world a better and safer place for people. And as a professional engineer, I made a pledge to protect the health and safety of the public. And I can't think of a single engineering project I've ever worked on where safety wasn't the most important topic. So before we get started at our Rocketry Camp, I want to talk to you a little bit about safety and how we can keep ourselves safe this week. You know, model rocketry is a pretty safe hobby, but it does have some hazards, and we need to know what those hazards are so we can avoid them and so that nobody gets injured. There are three basic large hazards which you're going to run into this week when you're working on your projects. One is sharp objects that can cut you, and a second one is some of the glues and adhesives we work, which have some noxious odors. And finally, we have small parts, which probably aren't a hazard to you, but could be a hazard to other people in your house. We're going to briefly talk about all of these hazards and how we can mitigate them. There are additional hazards to the actual launching of rockets, which we're not going to cover now, because we'll cover those face-to-face with you on the day that you do your launch. As I said, the first of these safety hazards that we need to worry about are sharp objects like knives and pins that can cut us and hurt us. And I need to say before we get started that whenever I'm dealing with anything sharp or anything that could fly in the air and hit my eyes, I always put my safety glasses on. These safety glasses go a long way in protecting me from some of the hazards that come about from sharp objects. Now, we provided you a pair of safety glasses in your kit, so be sure to use your safety glasses whenever you're using your knives or your pins or any other sharp objects. As I said, the biggest hazard you will encounter this week are things that are sharp and can cause cuts or puncture wounds. One of the sharp objects that you'll use this week are these push pins or these T-pins. They're not very hazardous really, but they do have sharp ends, and if you're not careful you can hurt yourself. There's two keys to using these properly. The first is always handle them by the back side where they were intended to be picked up. Don't pick them up from the front by the pointy end or handle the pointy end. That's just a way to get yourself hurt. So always pick them up by the back side where they have been meant to hold. The second trick is whenever you push these into something, always push them into the table or push them in a way that you're pushing away from yourself. Never hold something and try and put one of these pins while you're pushing it towards yourself, because if you slip off the edge, you could easily puncture yourself and hurt yourself. And finally, I like to keep a little box or a tray or something to put these pins in so that I can keep them from falling on the floor. That way they don't fall on the floor, somebody accidentally step on them, or maybe a young person picks them up and does something with them dangerous. So keep them in a box and that'll keep them safe. So again, the keys to using these pins safely are always handle them by the back where they're meant to be handled, and when you're using them, push them into the table or away from yourself, never towards yourself. The other very sharp tool that you'll be using this week is this hobby knife. These knives have very sharp blades on them. We need sharp blades to do our work properly, but we need to use these correctly so we don't hurt ourselves. The hobby knives we've provided you have a retractable blade. As you can see, there's no blade sticking out the end of this knife, and I can touch it without hurting myself. In order to use the knife, we push this handle at the back of the blade down, and the blade extends out the front of the knife and locks. When we're done using the blade, we simply push this button on the top, and the blade retracts back in the knife. So the first rule of using hobby knives is always have the blade retracted unless you're using the knife. It will save a lot of potential injuries. It's very common for someone to cut themselves on an open blade that's just lying around. If you keep the blade retracted, you won't have these hazards. When you do need to use a knife, the same rule I just described for pins applies. That is, never cut towards yourself, always cut down on the table or away from yourself. For example, if I need to cut out this fin pattern, I'm going to extend the blade, and I will always use a straight edge to cut straight lines. And so I'll put this straight edge down on the paper where I want to make a cut, and hold it there, and then I'll cut down onto the paper so I'm not cutting anywhere near myself. And then I've made a nice cut in this paper and it's all safe. Never cut towards yourself. If you need to cut some object such as this, don't ever do something where you're cutting towards yourself, because if you slip, you're definitely going to cut yourself. If you need to cut an object like this, put it on the table or in some other fashion. Find a way where you can cut it where you're not cutting towards yourself, but you're cutting away from yourself or down into the table. So that's really all there is to using this knife safely. When you don't need it, keep the blade retracted. And when you do use it, cut down to the table and away from yourself so you don't, but never cut towards yourself. A hazard that we all forget about a lot are small objects, such as this fishing swivel or this battery or even this small blob of clay. We don't think of these as hazards because we're old enough to know not to swallow them, stick them up our noses, or poke them in our ears. And you may be laughing now, but trust me, every day young children swallow or stick similar objects into their ears, noses, and other places. So keep these small objects away from young children. Put them away in a safe place where they won't pick them up and be tempted to swallow them or do some other bad things with them. The last thing I want to talk to you about is the adhesives that we'll be using. That is the glues and cements. I want to both tell you about how to use them safely and secondly, explain when to use each type. Your rocket uses a number of different materials, and if you don't use the right adhesive for a certain material, your rocket may not hold together. We will be using 3 different adhesives in this project: plastic model cement, cyanoacrylate or CA glue, and yellow wood glue. The first safety rule of these adhesives is keep them away from small children. Don't leave them lying around where small children can reach them. Let's start by talking about the plastic model cement. You'll be able to recognize this because the tube says on it, plastic model cement. And guess what? Plastic model cement is only to be used when gluing plastic pieces together. Don't use it for any other purpose. The only place you'll be needing this glue is if you have the 2-part nose cone like this. If you do, you'll need to use the plastic to cement to join the 2 plastic pieces together. The main hazard with this plastic cement is that it gives off a noxious gas, so you don't want to breathe it in. To control this, follow 2 simple rules. 1. Leave the cap on as much as possible. Don't leave the tube lying around with the cap off. Second, use the smallest amount of glue necessary. In most cases, you only need a small bead of glue to join the 2 pieces together. So just use a small bead of glue when you're putting it together. Both those things will limit the amount of hazardous gases that you get. So, plastic cement, only for plastic pieces. We'll also be using this cyanoacrylate glue. That's a hard word to say, so we usually just call this CA glue. You'll probably most commonly know this as super glue, but that's actually a specific brand name of CA glue. This is a really good glue for specific purposes, but it's also pretty hazardous, so we only want to use it when it's necessary. It has the same noxious gas hazards that plastic cement has, but its biggest hazard is that it dries super fast and super strong, so it's easy to do things like glue your fingers together or glue your fingers to part of your rocket. To use this glue safely, we're only going to use it for a few times when we really need it. And there are only 2 things that we need it for. The first is when we glue our fins onto our body tube. When we glue our fins onto our body tube, we want a good strong bond, plus we want the glue to set really quickly. So we'll be using CA glue when we glue our fins onto our body tube. And the second place we'll be using the CA glue is when we need to glue our launch lugs on our body tube for the same reason. We want it to be nice and strong and we want it to set really quickly. So the only times we'll be using the CA cement are to glue our fins and our launch lugs onto our body tube. When you do use this glue, always use a piece of paper underneath your workspace so that if you drip, you don't get it on your table. And also, in order to avoid getting it stuck, when you open the tube, Keep your fingers away from the tip where the CA glue is. If you keep your fingers away from the tip, then you won't get glue on your fingers and you won't get them stuck together. And finally, when you put a bead of this glue on something, put the thinnest bead of glue on there possible. It doesn't take very much of this glue to make a really, really strong bond. So you put just a thin layer on there when you go to put this fin on your rocket, and that will work just fine. So that's CA glue. We're going to use it only for two purposes, putting on our fins and putting on our launch lugs. When we do use it, use it on top of a piece of paper. Keep your fingers away from the tip, and you use just the teeniest amount that you need to. That will keep you safe using CA glue. The last glue I want to talk about is this yellow wood glue. This is actually the glue that we'll be using the most. It's easy to use, it's not hazardous, it cleans up with water, and if you get it on your hands, you can just rub it off. You could even swallow this glue without getting hurt, although I don't recommend that. The important thing to know about this glue is that it's really good at gluing paper things together and at gluing wood to paper. We're going to use it when we assemble our motor mount, for instance, because all the parts of this, for the most part, are gluing paper onto paper. So it's really good for that. Another place we're going to use this glue is when we need to make fillets on our fins and on our launch lug. And that's when we want to put a layer of glue right along the edge of the joint there. And we're going to be using this wood glue along those places. So wood glue is for gluing paper to paper or wood to paper. It's not toxic, it's not hazardous, and it's the one we'll use the most. And it actually bonds those materials together more strongly than even the super glue. So, to summarize adhesives, wood glue, very safe. We'll use it for gluing paper to paper and wood to paper. CA glue, dries super fast and super strong. Don't get it on your skin. We'll only use it for a few special things. And plastic cement, we're only going to use this to glue plastic to plastic. Finally, you should always have a good surface to cut on. This isn't exactly a safety issue, but it will keep you from ruining the table or the countertop that you use. I like using a cutting mat like this, but you can use a cutting board or even a piece of cardboard if you need to. In summary, the things we need to worry about in terms of safety for our program are sharp objects, small objects that could get swallowed, and glues and adhesives. So if you'll follow these safety rules and use the right glue for the right application, you'll have a safe, injury-free week and you'll build a strong model rocket.